The Psychological Test by Edogawa Ranpo. Fukiya might have gone a long way in the world if he had only put his considerable intelligence to better use. Young, bright, and diligent, and the constant pride of his professors at Waseda University in Tokyo, anyone could have seen that he was a man earmarked for a promising future. But alas, in collaboration with the fates, Fukiya chose to fool all observers. Instead of pursuing a normal scholastic career, he shattered it abruptly by committing murder. Today, many years following his shocking crime, conjecture is still rife as to what strange, unearthly motive actually prompted this gifted young man to carry out his violent plot. Some still persist in their belief that greed for money, the most common of motives, was behind it all. To some extent, this explanation is plausible, for it is true that young Fukiya, who was working his way through school, was keenly feeling the leanness of his purse. Also, being the intellectual that he was, his pride may have been so deeply wounded at having to consume so much of his precious time working that he might have felt that crime was the only way out. But are these altogether obvious reasons sufficient to explain away the almost unparalleled viciousness of the crime he committed? Others have advanced the far more likely theory that Fukiya was a born criminal and had committed the crime merely for its own sake. At any rate, whatever his hidden motives, it is an undeniable fact that Fukiya, like many other intellectual criminals before him, had set out to commit the perfect crime. From the day Fukiya began his first classes at Waseda, he was restless and uneasy. Some noxious force seemed to be eating away at his mind, coaxing him, goading him on to execute a plot, which was still only a vague outline in his mind, like a shadow in a mist. Day in and day out, while attending lectures, chatting with his friends on the campus, or working at odd jobs to cover his expenses, he kept puzzling over what was making him so nervous. And then one day, he became specially chummy with a classmate named Saitou, and his plot began to take definite shape. Saitou was a quiet student of about the same age as Fukiya, and likewise hard up for money. For nearly a year now, he had rented a room in the home of a widow who had been left in quite comfortable circumstances upon the death of her husband, a government official. Nearly 60 years old, the woman was extremely avaricious and stingy. Despite the fact that the income from rent on several houses ensured her a comfortable living, she still greedily added to her wealth by lending money in small sums to reliable acquaintances. But then, she was childless, and as a result had gradually come to regard money, ever since the early stages of her widowhood, as a substitute consolation. In the case of Saitou, however, she had taken him as a lodger more for protection than for gain. Like all people who hoard money, she kept a large sum cached away in her house. Fukiya had no sooner learned all this from his friend Saitou than he was tempted by the widow's money. What earthly good will it ever do her anyway? He asked himself repeatedly, following 2 or 3 visits to the house. Anyone can see that the withered old hag is not long for this world. But look at me. I'm young, full of life and ambition, with a bright future to look forward to. His thoughts constantly revolved about this subject, leading to but one conclusion. He just had to have that money. But how to get it? The answer to this question grew into the web of a horrible plan. First, however, Fukiya decided that all successful plots depended on one important factor: skillful and thorough preparation. So in a subtle and casual manner, he set about the task of getting as much information as possible from his schoolmate Saitou about the old woman and her hidden money. One day, Saitou casually made a remark which nearly bowled Fukiya over, for it was the very information he had long been yearning to know. "You know, Fukiya," Saitou remarked laughingly, utterly unsuspecting the foul plot that was being nursed in his friend's mind. "The old woman surely is crazy about her money. Nearly every month she thinks up a new place to hide it. Today, quite by accident, I came across her latest safety deposit vault, and I must say she's exceedingly original. Can you guess where it is?" Suppressing his excitement with an actor's finesse, Fukiya yawned and blandly remarked, "I'm afraid I couldn't even make a guess." Saitou was easily caught in the artful trap. "Well then, I'll tell you," he quickly said, somewhat disappointed by the other's lack of interest. "As you probably know, when a person tries to hide money, he usually puts it under the floor or in some secret cavity or hole in the wall. But my dear landlady's far more ingenious. Do you remember that dwarf pine tree that sits in the alcove of the guest room? Well, that's the newest place she's chosen to hide her money, right inside the earth in the pot. Don't you think she's awfully clever? No thief would ever think of looking in a place like that. As the days passed, Saitou appeared to have forgotten the conversation, but not Fukiya. Having devoured Saito's every word, he was now determined to take possession of the old woman's money, but there were still certain details which had to be figured out before he could make his first move. One of these was the all-important problem of how to divert even the faintest suspicion from himself. Other questions, such as remorse and the attendant pangs of conscience, troubled him not in the least. All this talk of Raskolnikov, in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, crucified by the unseen terrors of a haunted heart, was, to Fukiya, sheer nonsense. After all, he reasoned, everything depended on one's point of view. Was Napoleon to be condemned as a mass murderer because he had been responsible for the deaths of so many people? Certainly not. In fact, he rather admired the ex-corporal who had risen to be an emperor, no matter what the means. Now definitely committed to the deed, Fukiya calmly awaited his chance. As he called frequently to see Saitou, he already knew the general layout of the house, and a few more visits provided him with all the details he needed. For example, he soon learned that the old woman rarely went out of doors. This was a disappointment. Day after day, she remained seated in her private parlor in one wing of the house in absolute silence. If, however, sheer necessity did coax her to leave the comfort of her shell, she would first post her maidservant, a simple country girl, as a sentry to keep watch over the house. Fukiya soon came to realize that in the face of these circumstances, his contemplated adventure in crime would be no easy matter. On the contrary, if he was ever to succeed, he would have to use his greatest cunning. For a full month, Fukiya considered various schemes, but one by one he discarded them all as faulty. Finally, after racking his brain to the point of exhaustion, Fukiya came to the conclusion that there was but one solution. He must murder the old woman. He also reasoned that the old woman's hidden fortune would certainly be large enough to justify killing her, and reminded himself that the most notorious burglars in history had always eliminated their victims on the sound theory that the dead tell no tales. Carefully, Fukiya began to map out the safest course of action. This took time, but through the innocent Saitou, he knew that the hiding place had not been changed, and he felt he could afford to make each tiny detail perfect, even down to the most trivial matter. One day, quite unexpectedly, Fukiya realized that his long-awaited moment had arrived. First, he heard that Saitou would be absent from the house all day on school business. The maidservant, too, would be away on an errand, not to return until evening. Quite by coincidence, just 2 days previously, Fukiya had gone to the trouble of verifying that the money was still concealed in the pot of the dwarf pine. He had ascertained this quite easily. While visiting Saitou, he had casually gone into the old landlady's room to pay his respects, and during the course of his conversation, had ingeniously let drop a remark here and there referring to her hidden cache of money. An artful student of psychology, he had watched the old woman's eyes whenever he mentioned the words hiding place. As he had anticipated, her eyes turned unintentionally toward the potted tree in the alcove every time. On the day of the murder, Fukiya dressed in his usual school uniform and cap, plus his black student's cloak. He also wore gloves to be sure he would leave no fingerprints. Long ago, he had decided against a disguise, for he had realized that masquerade outfits would be easy to trace. He was of the firm conviction that the simpler and more open his crime was, the harder it would be to detect. In his pockets, he carried a longish but ordinary jackknife and a large purse. He had purchased these commonplace objects at a small general merchandise store at a time when it was full of customers, and he had paid the price asked without haggling. So he was confident no one would remember him as the purchaser. Immersed in his thoughts, Fukiya slowly walked toward the scene of his contemplated crime. As he gradually drew near the neighborhood, he reminded himself for about the 10th time that it was essential for him not to be observed entering the house. But supposing he accidentally ran into an acquaintance before he could reach his victim's gate? Well, this would not be serious so long as the acquaintance could be persuaded to believe that he was only out taking a stroll. as was his custom. 15 minutes later, he arrived in front of the old woman's house. Although he had fortunately not met a soul who knew him, he found his breath coming in short gasps. This to him was a nasty sensation. Somehow he was beginning to feel more and more like an ordinary thief and prowler than the suave and nonchalant prince of crime he had always pictured himself to be. Fighting to control his nerves, Fukiya furtively looked about in all directions. Finally, satisfied that he was still unobserved, he turned his attention to the house itself. This was sandwiched in between two other houses, but conveniently isolated from them by two rows of trees on both sides, thick with foliage and forming natural fences. Facing the house on the opposite side, there stood a long concrete wall which encircled a wealthy estate occupying a complete block. Slowly and noiselessly, he opened the gate, holding the tiny bell which was attached so as to prevent it from tinkling. Once inside the yard, he walked stealthily to one of the side entrances and called out softly. "Good morning," he called, noting with alarm that his voice did not sound at all like his own. Immediately there was a reply, accompanied by the rustling sound of a kimono, and the next moment the old woman came to the door. "Good morning, Mr. Fukiya," she greeted, kneeling and bowing politely. "I'm afraid your friend Mr. Saitou isn't in." It's you I wish to speak to," Fukiya explained quickly, "although the matter concerns Saitou." "Then please come in," she invited. After he had taken off his shoes, she ushered him into the reception room, where she apologized for being alone in the house. "My maid is out today," she said, "so you must excuse me while I get the tea things. I won't be a minute." She rose and turned to leave the room. This was the very opportunity Fukiya was waiting for. As the old woman bent herself a little in order to open the paper door, he pounced on her from behind and slowly proceeded to strangle her with his two gloved hands. Feebly, the old woman struggled, and one of her fingers scratched a folded screen which was standing close by. After the old woman went limp, Fukiya carefully examined the damage. The screen had two folds, and its surface was covered with gold flakes and a painting showing Komachi, a noted beauty of the feudal era. It was precisely on Komachi's face that the old woman had scratched in her death throes. Fukiya soon recovered his composure, for he felt that this was too trivial to mean anything. He put the matter out of his mind and, going to the alcove, grabbed the pine tree by the trunk and pulled it out of the pot. As he had expected, he found a bundle lying in the base of the pot, neatly wrapped up in oil paper. Eagerly, he undid the wrapping and grinned with satisfaction when a thick wad of paper money came to light. Wasting no time, Fukiya took half of the money, stuffed it into the new purse that he took out of his pocket, rewrapped the rest in the same oil paper, and replaced the package at the bottom of the pot. He considered this move to be his master stroke, for he felt certain that it would throw the police miles off the track. Considering that the old woman was the only person who could have known exactly how much money she had hidden, no one would be any the wiser even if the amount were reduced to one-half of the original sum. Fukiya's next move was to stab the old woman carefully in the heart with the long jackknife. Then he wiped the blade on the woman's kimono and replaced it in his pocket. The purpose of this strange act was simply to make doubly sure that she could not be revived, a possibility he had often read about in crime novels. He had not killed her with the knife, for fear her blood might spatter on his clothing. Fukiya replaced the tree in the pot, smoothed out the earth, and otherwise made certain that no clues had been left behind. Then he went out of the room. After closing the door, he tiptoed silently to the side entrance. Here, as he tied his shoelaces, he wondered if his shoes might leave telltale marks. But then he decided there was no danger, for the entryway was floored with cement. Stepping out into the garden, he felt even more secure because it was a sunny day and the ground was hard and dry. Now, the only thing left for him to do was to walk to the front gate, open it, and vanish from the scene. His heart was beating wildly, for he realized that one slip now would be fatal. He strained his ears for the slightest warning of danger, such as approaching footfalls, but all he could hear were the melodious notes of a Japanese harp tinkling in the distance. Straightening his shoulders, Fukiya strode to the gate, opened it boldly, and walked away. 4 or 5 blocks away from the old woman's house, there stood a high stone wall enclosing an old Shinto shrine. Fukiya dropped his jackknife and his blood-spattered gloves through a crevice in the wall down into a ditch, then walked on in a leisurely manner to a small park, where he frequently went walking. Here he sat on a bench and casually watched several children playing on the swings. After spending considerable time in the park, he rose from his seat, yawned and stretched, and then made his way to a nearby police station. Greeting the sergeant at the desk, with a perfectly innocent look, he produced his well-filled purse. "Officer, I just found this purse on the street. It's full of money, so I thought I'd better turn it in." The policeman took the purse, examined its contents, and asked several routine questions. Fukiya, perfectly calm and self-possessed, answered straightforwardly, indicating the place and time he had made his find. Naturally, all the information he gave was pure fabrication, with one exception. He gave his correct name and address. After filling out several forms, the sergeant handed him a receipt. Fukiya pocketed the receipt and for a moment wondered again if he was acting wisely. From every point of view, however, this was assuredly the safest course to take. Nobody knew that the old lady's money had been reduced by half. Also, it was quite obvious to Fukiya that no one would come to claim the purse. According to Japanese law, all the money in the purse would become his if no one claimed it within 1 year. Of course, it would be a long time to wait, but what of it? It was just like money in the bank, something he could count on, something to look forward to. On the other hand, if he had hidden the money to await an opportune time to spend it, it would have meant risking his neck every moment of the day. But the way he had chosen eliminated even the remotest danger of detection, even if the old lady had kept a record of the serial numbers of the banknotes. While walking home from the police station, Fukiya continued to gloat silently over the masterful way he had carried out his crime. "A simple case of sheer genius," he said to himself with a chuckle. "And what a big joke on the police. Imagine, a thief turning in his spoils. Under such circumstances, how could anyone possibly suspect me? Why, not even the great Buddha himself would ever guess the truth." On the following day, after waking from a sound and untroubled sleep, Fukiya looked at the morning paper, delivered to his bedside by the maid of the boarding house. Stifling a yawn, he glanced at the page which carried the human interest stories. Suddenly, he caught sight of a brief item, which caused his eyes to open wide. The first part of the story was an account of the discovery of the old woman's body. This was neither surprising nor startling to Fukiya, but the report went on to disclose that his friend Saitou had been arrested by the police as the main suspect, having been discovered with a large sum of money on his person. Actually, Fukiya thought, this fact too was nothing to become disturbed about. Instead, the development was decidedly advantageous to his own security. As one of Saitou's closest friends, however, he also realized that he would have to inquire about him at the police station. Fukiya dressed hastily and then called at the police station mentioned in the newspaper story. This turned out to be the very same place where he had reported the finding of the purse. Curse my luck, he swore to himself when he made this embarrassing discovery. Why hadn't he selected a different police station to report the money to? Well, it was too late now to change things. Skillfully, he expressed deep anxiety over the unfortunate plight of his friend. He asked if they would permit him to see Saitou and received a polite no. He then tried to make a few inquiries into the circumstances which had led to his friend's arrest. But here again he was refused. Fukiya, however, didn't much care, for even without being told, he could easily imagine what had happened. On the fateful day, Saitou must have returned to the house ahead of the maid. By that time, of course, he himself had already committed his horrible deed and left the house. Then Saitou must have found the corpse. Before reporting the crime to the police, however, he must have remembered the money hidden in the pot. If this was the work of a robber, Saitou must have figured, the money would surely be gone. Curious to know if his reasoning was correct, he had examined the pot and had found the money there wrapped in oil paper. And Fukiya could easily imagine what must have happened after that. Undoubtedly, Saitou was tempted to keep the money for himself. This was a natural reaction, although, of course, it was a foolish thing for him to do. Thinking that everybody would believe that the murderer of the old woman had stolen the money, Saitou pocketed the whole amount. And his next move? This too was easy to surmise. He had recklessly gone ahead and reported his discovery of the old woman's corpse, with the money still on his person, never suspecting that he would be one of the first to be questioned and searched. What an utter fool. But wait, Fukiya reasoned further. Saitou would certainly put up a desperate struggle to clear himself of suspicion. Then what? Would his statements possibly incriminate him, Fukiya, in any way? If Saitou just kept insisting that the money was his, all might be well. But then, the fact that the amount was exceptionally large, much too large for a student like Saitou to possess, might give the lie to such a statement. The only alternative left for Saitou would be to tell the truth, the whole truth. This would lead, by clever cross-examination on the part of the prosecutor, to the revelation that Saitou had also told Fukiya where the old lady had hidden her money. Only 2 days preceding the day of the crime, Fukiya could even hear Saitou telling the court, "My friend Fukiya conversed with the victim in the very room in which she was murdered. Knowing that she had that money hidden in the tree pot, could he not have committed the crime? I also wish to remind you, gentlemen of the court, that Fukiya has always been notorious for being financially hard up." Although feeling decidedly uncomfortable after this soliloquy, Fukiya's optimism soon conquered his initial dismay. Emerging from the police station with a perfectly blank look on his face, he returned to his boarding house and ate a rather late breakfast. While eating, his original bravado returned, and he even made a point of telling the maid who served him about several aspects of the case. Shortly after, he went to school, where he found both on the campus and in the classrooms that Saito's arrest as a suspect in the murder case was the main topic of conversation. The investigator placed in charge of this sensational case was District Attorney Kasamori, noted not only as a man with excellent legal training, but also well known for valuable accomplishments of his own, especially in the field of psychological research. Whenever he came across a case which could not be unraveled by the standard methods of crime detection, he employed his fund of psychological knowledge with amazing results. With a man of Kasamori's reputation taking in hand the case of the old lady's murder, the public immediately became convinced that the mystery would soon be solved. Kasamori, too, was confident that he could ultimately crack the case, no matter how complex it appeared, at this early stage of the investigation. He began with a preliminary check of everything connected with the case, so that by the time it reached a public trial, every single phase would be as clear as daylight. As the investigation proceeded, however, he found the case more and more difficult to handle. From the outset, the police kept insisting that no one but Saitou could be the guilty party. Kasamori himself admitted the logic of the police theory. For after all, every person who had been even remotely connected with the murdered old woman had been investigated and cleared of suspicion. Everyone, that is, except her student lodger, the hapless Saitou. Fukiya, too, had been among those who had been questioned, along with creditors of the old woman, her tenants, and even casual acquaintances. But he had quickly been eliminated. In the case of Saitou, there was one major point which worked to his great disadvantage. This was that he was extremely weak by nature, and completely terrorized by the stern atmosphere of the court. He was unable to answer even the simplest questions without first stuttering and stammering, and showing all the symptoms of a man with a guilty conscience. Furthermore, in his excited state, he often retracted his previous statements, forgot vital details, and then tried to cover up by making other contradictory remarks, all of which tended only to incriminate him further and further. Simultaneously, there was another factor which tortured him and drove him to the verge of insanity. This was the fact that he was guilty of having stolen half of the old woman's money, precisely as Fukiya had theorized. The district attorney carefully summed up the evidence, circumstantial as it was, against Saitou, and pitied him deeply. It could not be denied that all the odds were against him. But Kasamori asked himself again and again, had this weak, blubbering fool been capable of committing such a vicious, cold-blooded murder? He doubted it. So far, Saitou had not confessed, and conclusive proof of his guilt was still lacking. A month went by, but the preliminary probe had not yet been completed. The district attorney became decidedly annoyed and impatient at the slow pace of the investigation. "Curse the slow-grinding wheels of the law," he exploded to a subordinate one day while rechecking his documents on the case for what was probably the 100th time. "At this rate, it'll take us 1,000 years to solve the case." He then strode angrily to another desk and picked up a sheaf of routine documents filled out by the captain of the police station in whose jurisdiction the murder of the old lady fell. He looked casually at one of the papers and noticed that a purse containing 95,000 yen in 1,000 yen notes had been found at a spot near the old lady's house on the same day of the murder. The finder of the money, he further learned from the report, was a student, Fukiya by name, and a close friend of Saito's, the key murder suspect. For some reason, possibly because of the urgency of other duties, the police captain had failed to submit his report earlier. After finishing reading the report, Kasamori's eyes lit up with a strange glow. For a full month now, he had felt like a person fumbling in the dark. And then came this information, like a thin ray of light. Could it have any significance? Any bearing on the case at hand? He decided to find out without delay. Fukiya was quickly summoned, and the district attorney questioned him closely. After a full hour's questioning, however, Kasamori found he was getting nowhere. Asked as to why he had not mentioned the incident of his finding the purse when he had been interrogated previously in connection with the murder, Fukiya maintained calmly that he had not thought the matter to have any bearing on the case. This reply, given straightforwardly, sounded most reasonable, for the money believed to have belonged to the old lady had been found in Saito's possession. Naturally, therefore, who could have imagined that the money found on the street was also a part of the old lady's property? Nevertheless, Kasamori was deeply puzzled. Was it nothing but a mere coincidence that the very man who was a close friend of Saito's, the leading suspect, the man whom, according to Saito's testimony in court, had also known where the old lady had hidden her money, had picked up so large a sum at a spot not far from the place where the murder had been committed? Here indeed was a conundrum worthy of the mind of a master sleuth. Struggling angrily with the problem, the district attorney cursed the unfortunate fact that the serial numbers of the banknotes had not been recorded by the old woman. Had they been recorded, it would have been a most simple task to verify whether the money found by Fukiya was part of the same loot. If only I could find one single clue, he kept repeating to himself. In the days that followed, Kasamori revisited the scene of the crime and talked to the victim's relatives, going over the same ground again and again, but all to no avail. He had to admit that he was up against a wall, with not a single tangible clue to follow up. So far as he could see, the only possible way in which he could explain the episode of Fukiya's finding the purse was that the man had stolen half of the old lady's savings, left the remainder in the hiding place, put the stolen money in a purse, and pretended that he had found it on the street. But was it really possible that such a fantastic thing could have been done? The purse, of course, had been subjected to the closest scrutiny and placed under a microscope for even the faintest of possible clues. But all these efforts had proved negative. Also, according to Fukiya's own statement, he had taken a walk on the day of the murder. In fact, he had even admitted that he had passed the old lady's house. Would a man who was guilty be so bold as to make such a dangerous admission? And then, what about the weapon which had been used to stab the old woman? The entire house and garden, as well as the surrounding area within a large radius, had been searched with a fine-tooth comb, but there was not a trace of it. In the absence of conclusive evidence to the contrary, Kasamori felt that the police were justified in pointing to Saitou as the most likely suspect. But then again, the district attorney reasoned, if Saitou could be guilty, so could Fukiya. Thus, after an investigation which had stretched out to a full month and a half, the only point which had been established was that there were two possible suspects, but without a shred of concrete evidence to convict either. Reaching this impasse, Kasamori decided there was still one other method he could use in his attempt to break the case. This was to subject the two suspects to a psychological test, a method which had been useful in the past. When he had first been questioned by the police 2 or 3 days after the murder, Fukiya had learned that the district attorney who had been put in charge of the case was the noted amateur psychologist Kasamori, and the information filled him with panic. Cool and collected as he had been until then, he soon came to dread the very sound of the district attorney's name, especially after he had been summoned a second time and questioned by Kasamori himself. Supposing, just supposing, he were to be subjected to a psychological test. What then? Would he be able to hold his own in the face of such an experiment, the nature of which he knew absolutely nothing about? The shock of this possibility was so stunning that he became too uneasy to attend his classes. He remained in his room on the pretext of illness and tried desperately to figure out how he could match wits for wits. Of course, There was absolutely no way of anticipating the form of psychological test that Kasamori might employ. Fukiya therefore applied all the test methods he could possibly imagine on himself in order to discover the best possible way to circumvent them. Since a psychological test by nature was a method applied to reveal all false statements, Fukiya's first thought was that it would be utterly impossible to lie his way out of such a test. Fukiya knew there were psychological tests which used lie detector devices to record physical reactions. He had also heard that there was a simpler method which used a stopwatch to measure the time it took a suspect to answer questions. Reflecting upon the many and various psychological methods of crime detection, Fukiya became more and more concerned. Supposing he were caught by a surprise question like, "You're the one who killed the old woman, aren't you?" fired at him point blank. Fukiya felt confident that he would be able to shoot back calmly. "What proof do you have for such a wild supposition?" But if a lie detector were to be used, wouldn't it record his startled state of mind? Wouldn't it be absolutely impossible for a normal human being to prevent such physical reactions? Fukiya tried asking himself various hypothetical questions. Strangely, no matter how unexpected his questions were, when they were addressed to himself by himself, he could not imagine that they produced any physical changes within him. Gradually, he became convinced that so long as he avoided becoming nervously excited, he would be safe even in the face of the most accurate instrument. While conducting these various experiments on himself, Fukiya suddenly became convinced that the effects of a psychological test might be neutralized by training. He became sure that the reaction of a man's nerves to a pointed question would become less each time the question was repeated. Granting that his reasoning was sound, Fukiya told himself, the best method of neutralization was to become accustomed to the questions. He reasoned that his own questions to himself produced no reaction because he already knew both question and answer before he spoke. Fukiya painstakingly began to examine every page of a thick dictionary and to jot down those words which might possibly be used in questions to be thrown at him. For a full week, he spent most of his waking hours this way, training his nerves against all possible questions. Then, feeling that his mind had been fairly well fortified in this field, he turned to another. This was the word association test, which Fukiya knew psychiatrists used widely in examining patients. As Fukiya understood it, the patient, or accused, would be told to answer any word given him with the first word that came to his mind, and then the examiner would call off a list of words with absolutely no bearing on the case: screen, desk, ink, pen, and the like. The significance of the test lay in the fact that the word given in reply would have some mental association with the previously recited word. For example, if the word happened to be screen, the culprit might come out with such words as window, windowsill, paper, or door. And in the course of the test, such incriminating words as knife, money, or purse would be slipped in so as to befuddle the accused in his association of ideas. In Fukiya's case, for instance, if he were not on his guard, he might reply money to dwarf tree, thereby unconsciously admitting that he knew money to have been stolen from the pot of the tree. On the other hand, if he prepared for the ordeal in advance, he could answer with a harmless word like earthenware instead of money. Then, of course, he would be in the clear. Fukiya knew that, in conducting the word diagnosis, the exact time elapsing between question and answer was always recorded. If, for example, the accused said door in reply to screen in 1 second, and then took 3 seconds to say earthenware in reply to dwarf tree, it could be inferred that the man had taken more time to frame the second reply in order to suppress the first idea which leaped to his mind. Such a time discrepancy, of course, would arouse suspicion. Fukiya also reasoned that if he were given a word test, it would be far safer to answer in the most obviously natural manner. He therefore decided that in reply to dwarf tree, he would say either pine or money, because even if he had not been the culprit, the police would know that he would be sufficiently acquainted with the facts of the crime for this to be a natural answer for him to give. One question, however, called for deeper thought. This was the matter of timing, but he felt that this too could be managed by careful training. The important thing was that if a word like dwarf tree was fired at him, he should be able to reply money or pine without a moment's hesitation. For several days, Fukiya worked hard at training himself, until finally he felt that he could satisfactorily pass the strictest test. Furthermore, he derived immense consolation from the knowledge that Saitou, although innocent of the murder, would also be exposed to the same volley of questions and would certainly exhibit a similar degree of nervousness. The more Fukiya considered all these possibilities, the greater became his sense of security and self-confidence. In fact, now that he was once again feeling completely at ease, he was able to whistle and sing, and even to wish strongly for a summons from District Attorney Kasamori. It was the day after the district attorney had subjected both suspects to psychological tests, and Kasamori was in his study at home, busily going over the results of the tests. Suddenly, his maid announced that he had a visitor. Literally buried under his papers, the district attorney was in no mood to play host, so he growled impatiently to his servant, "Kindly tell whoever it is that I'm too busy to see anyone today." "Yes, sir," the maid replied obediently, but as she turned, the door suddenly opened and the caller popped his head in playfully. "Good afternoon, Mr. District Attorney," the caller said cheerfully, ignoring the startled look of the servant. "Don't tell me you're too busy even to see your old friend Akechi." Kasamori dropped his pince-nez and looked up sharply, but immediately his face broadened into a happy grin. "Why, hello, doctor." "Akechi," he replied. "I didn't know it was you. Forgive me. Step right in and make yourself comfortable. As a matter of fact, I was hoping you'd drop in." Kasamori dismissed the maid with a grunt and motioned to his guest to be seated. A sleuth with a mind keen as a razor and a unique technique for solving knotty problems, Dr. Kogoro Akechi was the one man whom the district attorney would have stopped to talk to, even if he had been on his way to catch a train. On several previous occasions, he had asked for Dr. Akechi's cooperation in cracking what had been labeled impossible cases, and in every instance the man had lived up to his reputation as one of Japan's most remarkable detectives. After lighting a cigarette, Dr. Akechi nodded meaningfully toward the stacks of papers on the district attorney's desk. "I see you're very busy," he remarked casually. "Is it the case of the old woman who was murdered recently?" "Yes," the district attorney replied. "Frankly, I'm at the end of my rope." "Pessimism doesn't become you, Mr. District Attorney," said Dr. Akechi with a dry laugh. "Come now, tell me the results of the psychological tests you gave your two suspects." Kasamori raised his eyebrows. "How the devil did you know about my tests?" he asked sharply. "One of your assistants told me," Dr. Akechi explained. "You see, I'm deeply interested in the case, too, so I thought I'd come and offer you my humble services." "It was kind of you to come," Kasamori replied gratefully and quickly launched into a discussion of his complicated experiments. "The results, as you will notice," he said, "are clear enough, but there is something that has me completely baffled. Yesterday I gave each suspect two tests, a lie detector test based on pulse measurements and a word association test. In Fukiya's case, the pulse measurements were almost always above suspicion, but when I compared the results of the word association test, I found a tremendous difference between Saitou and Fukiya. In fact, the results were so far apart that I must admit I'm completely at a loss for an explanation. Just look at this questionnaire and observe the differences in the time taken by the two suspects in their replies to the same words." Kasamori then handed Dr. Akechi the following tabulation of the results of the word association test. "You see, everything is very plain," said the district attorney after Dr. Akechi had examined the paper. "According to this, Saitou must have willfully resorted to trickery. This is evident from the fact that he took so much time to respond, not only to the incriminating words, but also to the unimportant dummy words. Also, the long time he took in replying to dwarf tree probably indicates he was trying to suppress such natural, but in his opinion incriminating, words as money or pine. Now, on the other hand, take the case of Fukiya. He said pine in reply to dwarf tree, conceal in reply to oil paper, and murder in reply to crime. Surely if he were really guilty, he would have avoided uttering those words. Yet he replied in a perfectly matter-of-fact tone, without the slightest hesitation. From these facts, therefore, I am strongly inclined to rule him out as a suspect. At the same time, however, when it comes to deciding positively that Saitou is the guilty man, I simply can't bring myself to it, despite this record." Dr. Akechi listened calmly to the district attorney's reasoning without making any effort to interrupt. But after the latter had concluded his summing up, Dr. Akechi's eyes gleamed brightly, and he began to speak. Have you ever stopped to consider the weak points of a psychological test when he began? De Quiros has stated in criticism of the views entertained by Munsterberg, who advocated the psychological test, that although the system was devised as a substitute for torture, its actual result might well incriminate the innocent just as much as had trial by torture, thus allowing the real criminal to escape. Munsterberg himself has stated in his books that a psychological test is definitely effective in verifying whether a suspected person knows a certain other person, or place, or thing, but that for other purposes it is very dangerous. I realize that my telling you all this, Kasamori, is decidedly superfluous, but I just wanted to call your attention to these vital facts. The district attorney replied, with a trace of annoyance in his voice, that he was aware of these facts. Well then, Dr. Akechi continued, let us study the case at hand from an entirely different angle. Supposing, just supposing, an innocent man who is extremely nervous is suspected of a crime. He is arrested at the scene of the crime and is therefore aware of all the circumstances and the macabre setting. In such an event, could he preserve his composure if he was subjected to a rigid psychological test? He might very naturally say to himself, they are going to test me. What shall I say to escape suspicion? Considering that his mind would naturally be greatly excited, would not a psychological test conducted under such circumstances tend to incriminate the innocent party, as De Quiros has mentioned? I suppose you are talking about Saitou, said the district attorney, still annoyed. Yes, Dr. Akechi replied, and now granting that my reasoning is sound, he would be entirely innocent of the murder. Although, of course, the possibility still remains that he might actually have stolen the money. And now comes the big question. Who killed the old woman? Kasamori interrupted abruptly at this point. Come now, Doctor Akechi, he said impatiently. Don't keep me in suspense. Have you come to any definite conclusion as to who the actual killer is? Yes, I think so, Doctor Akechi replied, smiling broadly. Judging by the results of your psychological tests, I believe Fukiya is our man, although, of course, I cannot swear to it yet. Could we have him brought here? If I can ask him a few more questions, I feel positive that I can get to the bottom of this most intriguing case. But what about evidence? The district attorney asked, taken aback by the other's cool manner. Just how are you going to get your proof? Give a guilty man enough rope, rejoined Dr. Akechi philosophically, and he'll supply enough evidence to hang himself. Dr. Akechi then outlined his theory in detail. After hearing it, Kasamori clapped his hands to call his servant. Then, taking up pen and paper from his desk, he wrote the following note, addressed to Fukiya. Your friend Saitou has been found guilty of the crime. As there are a few points I wish to discuss with you, I request you to call at my private residence immediately. He signed the message and handed it to the servant. Fukiya had just returned from school when he received the note. Unaware that it was the bait for a carefully laid trap, he was elated over the news. Without bothering even to have his supper, he hurried to the district attorney's house. As soon as Fukiya entered the study, District Attorney Kasamori greeted him warmly and invited him to sit down. I owe you an apology, Mr. Fukiya, he said, for having suspected you for so long. Now that I know you to be innocent, I thought you might like to hear a few of the circumstances surrounding your complete exoneration. The district attorney ordered refreshments for everybody and then ceremoniously introduced the student to Dr. Akechi, although he used quite a different name for the latter. Mr. Yamamoto, he explained, indicating Dr. Akechi without batting an eyelash, is a lawyer who has been appointed by the old woman's heirs to settle her estate. After refreshments of tea and rice cakes, they discussed various unimportant matters, Fukiya talking very freely. In fact, as the time quickly sped by, he became the most loquacious of the three. Suddenly, however, he glanced at his wristwatch and rose abruptly. I didn't realize that it was so late, he announced apologetically. If you'll forgive me, I think I'd better be leaving. Of course, said the district attorney dryly. Dr. Akechi, however, suddenly interrupted. One moment, please, he said to Fukiya. There is just one trivial question I'd like to ask you before you leave. I wonder if you know there was a twofold gold screen standing in the room where the old woman was murdered. It has been slightly damaged, and a minor legal issue has been raised over it. You see, it appears that the screen didn't belong to the old woman, but was being held by her as security for a loan. And now the owner has come forward with the demand that he be reimbursed for the damage. My clients, however, are reluctant to agree to this, for they contend that the screen might have been damaged before it was brought into the house. Really, of course, it's a very trivial matter, but if you could by any chance help me to clear it up, I would be more than grateful. The reason I'm asking is because I understand you frequently visited the house to see your friend Saitou. Perhaps you may have noticed the screen? Saitou, of course, was asked about it, but in his excited condition, nothing that he said seemed to make much sense. I also tried to contact the old lady's maid, but she's already returned to her home in the country, and I haven't yet had an opportunity to write to her. Although Dr. Akechi had mentioned all this in a perfectly matter-of-fact tone of voice, Fukiya felt a slight tremor in his heart, but he quickly reassured himself. Why should I be startled? The case is already closed. He then asked himself what answer he should make. After a brief pause, he decided that his best course would be to speak frankly, just as he had always done. As the district attorney knows, he began, smiling innocently, I went into the room on only one occasion. That was 2 days before the murder. However, now that I come to think of it, I do remember that screen distinctly, and I can say that when I saw it, it was not damaged. Are you absolutely sure of this? Dr. Akechi quickly asked. Remember now, the damage I mean is a scratch on the face of Komachi painted on the screen. Yes, yes, I know, Fukiya said emphatically. And I'm positive I tell you that there was no scratch, neither on the face of the beautiful Komachi nor anywhere else. If it had been damaged in any way, I'm sure I could not have failed to notice it. Well then, would you mind making an affidavit? Dr. Akechi shot back. You see, the owner of the screen is very insistent in his demand, and I find it very difficult to deal with him. Not at all, Fukiya said in his most cooperative tone. I would be most willing to make an affidavit any time you say. Dr. Akechi thanked the student with a smile, then scratched his head, a habit of his whenever he was excited. And now, he continued, I think you can admit that you know a great deal about the screen, because in the record of your psychological test, I noticed that you replied screen to picture. A screen, as you know, is something rare in a student boarding house. Fukiya was surprised at Dr. Akechi's new tone. He wondered what the devil the man was trying to get at. Again, the man who had been introduced as a lawyer addressed him. By the way, he said, there was still another point which came to my attention. When the psychological test was conducted yesterday, there were 8 highly significant danger words on the list. You, of course, passed the test without a hitch. In fact, in my opinion, it went off altogether too smoothly. With your permission, I'd like to have you take a look at your record on those 8 key words. Dr. Akechi produced the tabulation of the results and said, you took little less time to answer the key words than the insignificant words. For example, in answer to dwarf tree, you said pine in only 0.6 of a second. This indicates remarkable innocence. Note that you took 1/10 of a second longer to answer to the word green, which of all the 28 words on the list is generally the easiest to respond to. Not quite understanding Dr. Akechi's motive, Fukiya began to wonder where all this talk was leading. Just what was this talkative lawyer up to, anyway, he asked himself with a shudder. He had to know and quickly, for it might be a trap. Dwarf tree, oil paper, crime, or any other of the 8 key words are not nearly so easy to associate with other words as are such words as head or green, Dr. Akechi continued tenaciously. And yet, you managed to answer the difficult words quicker than the easier ones. What does it all mean? This is what puzzled me all along. But now let me try to guess exactly what was in your mind. Really, it might prove to be quite amusing. Of course, if I'm wrong, I humbly beg your pardon. Fukiya felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This weird business was now really beginning to prey on his nerves. But before he could even attempt to interrupt, Dr. Akechi began speaking again. Surely you have been well aware all along of the dangers of a psychological test, he insisted to Fukiya. I take it, therefore, that you prepared yourself for the test well in advance. For example, for all words associated with the crime, you carefully drafted ready-made replies so that you could recite them at a moment's notice. Now, please don't misunderstand, Mr. Fukiya. I am not trying to criticize the method you adopted. I only want to point out that a psychological test is a dangerous experiment on occasions. More often than not, it snares the innocent and frees the guilty. Dr. Akechi paused to let the hidden implications of his statement sink in. Then he resumed again. You, Mr. Fukiya, made the fatal mistake of making your preparations with too much cunning. When you were confronted with the test, you spoke too fast. This, of course, was only natural because you were afraid that if you took too much time in answering the questions, you would be suspected. But you overdid it. Dr. Akechi paused again, noting with grim satisfaction that Fukiya's face was turning a sickly gray. Then he continued his summation. I come now to another significant phase of the test. Why did you choose to reply with such words as money, conceal, and murder? All words which were liable to incriminate you. I will tell you, it was because you purposely wanted to make out that you were naive. Am I not right, Fukiya? Isn't my reasoning sound? Fukiya stared with glassy eyes at the face of his tormentor. He tried hard to look away, to evade the cold, accusing eyes of Dr. Akechi, but for some reason he found he couldn't. It appeared to Kasamori as though Fukiya had been caught in a hypnotic trance and was unable to manifest any emotion other than fear. This seeming innocence of yours, Dr. Akechi continued, just did not strike me as being truly genuine. So I thought up the idea of asking you about the gold screen. Of course, the answer you gave was exactly the one I anticipated. Dr. Akechi suddenly turned to the district attorney. Now I want to ask you a simple question, Mr. District Attorney. Just when was the screen brought into the house of the old woman? The day before the crime, on the 4th of last month, Kasamori replied. The day before the crime, did you say? Dr. Akechi repeated loudly. But that's very strange. Mr. Fukiya just stated a moment ago that he saw it 2 days before the crime was committed, which was the 3rd of last month. Furthermore, he was very positive as to where he had seen it, in the very room where the old woman was murdered. Now this is all very contradictory. Surely one of you two must be mistaken. Mr. Fukiya must be the one who has made the miscalculation, observed the district attorney with a sly grin. Until the afternoon of the 4th, the screen was at the house of the owner. There is no question about it. Dr. Akechi watched Fukiya's face with rapt interest, for the expression that the latter now wore was akin to that of a little girl on the verge of tears. Suddenly, Dr. Akechi pointed an accusing finger at the student and demanded sharply, why did you say you saw something which you could not have seen? It's really too bad that you had to remember the classical painting, because by doing so you have betrayed yourself. In your anxiety to pretend to tell the truth, you even tried to elaborate on the details. Isn't this so, Fukiya? Could you have noticed that there was no folding screen in the room when you entered it 2 days before the crime? No, you certainly would not have paid any attention to such a detail because it had nothing to do with your plans. Furthermore, I think that even if it had been there, it would not have attracted your attention, because the room was elaborately decorated with various other paintings and antiques of a similar nature. So it was quite natural for you to assume that the screen which you saw on the day of the crime must have been there 2 days previously. My questions bewildered you, so you accepted their implications. Now, had you been an ordinary criminal, you would not have answered as you did. You would have tried to deny knowing anything about anything. But I had you sized up from the very beginning as being a real intellectual, and as such, I knew you would try to be as outspoken as possible so long as you did not touch upon anything dangerous. But I anticipated your moves and played my hand accordingly. Dr. Akechi then broke out into loud, boisterous laughter. Too bad, he said sarcastically to the crestfallen Fukiya, that you had to be trapped by a humble lawyer like myself. Fukiya remained silent, knowing that it would be useless to try and talk his way out. Clever as he was, he realized that any attempt to correct the fatal slip he had made would only drag him deeper and deeper into the pit of doom. After a long silence, Dr. Akechi spoke again. Can you hear the scratching of pen against paper, Fukiya? A police stenographer in the next room has been recording everything we've said here. He called out to someone in the adjoining room, and a moment later a young stenographer entered the study, carrying a sheaf of papers. "Please read your notes, Doctor," Akechi requested. The stenographer read the complete record, taken down word for word. "Now, Mr. Fukiya," Dr. Akechi said, "I would appreciate it if you will kindly sign the document and seal it with your fingerprint. Certainly you can have no objection, for you promised to testify regarding the screen at any time." Meekly, Fukiya signed the record and sealed it with an imprint of his thumb. A few moments later, several detectives from police headquarters, summoned by the district attorney, led the confessed slayer away. "The show now over, Doctor." Akechi turned to the district attorney. "As I have remarked before," he said, "Munsterberg was right when he said that the true merit of a psychological test lies in the discovery of whether or not a suspected person noticed any other person or thing at a certain place. In Fukiya's case, everything hinged on whether or not he had seen the screen. Apart from establishing that fact, no psychological test that you might have given Fukiya would have brought any remarkable results. Being the intellectual scoundrel he is, his mind was too well prepared to be defeated by any routine psychological questions." Rising from his seat with the air of a professor leaving his class following a lengthy lecture, Dr. Akechi put on his hat, then paused briefly for a final statement. "Just one more thing I would like to mention," he said with a smile. "In conducting a psychological test, there is no need for strange charts, machines, or word games. As discovered by the famous Judge Uka in the colorful days of 18th century Tokyo, who frequently applied psychological tests based on mere questions and answers, it's not too difficult to catch criminals in psychological traps. But of course, you have to ask the right questions. Well, good night, Mr. District Attorney, and thanks for the refreshments."